The tragic reality of organized crime in major cities. Organized crime is a shadow that looms large over major cities worldwide, a brutal force that operates from the darkest corners of urban life. In 2025, it is not just a relic of the past, but a thriving, evolving network that exploits every vulnerability in society. From drug trafficking and extortion to human trafficking and money laundering, organized crime affects everything. Every person, every institution, and every corner of the city. This is the grim reality of how these criminal enterprises have flourished. The story of organized crime in major cities is not a recent phenomenon. It traces its roots back to the early 20th century, with notorious crime families like the Gambinos in New York and the Outfit in Chicago dominating the underground scene. These organizations, initially built around bootlegging, soon branched into other illegal enterprises, including gambling, drugs, and racketeering. But as society advanced and urbanized, so too did these criminal empires. By the 1980s, organized crime had taken a sophisticated turn, with drug cartels in places like Los Angeles and Miami flooding the streets with narcotics. Cities across the U.S. became battlegrounds, not just for control over territory, but for the future of an entire generation. The presence of gangs, mafia families, and international crime syndicates grew, spreading violence and terror in neighborhoods where the law had little control. Today, in 2025, the landscape has changed dramatically. Criminal organizations are more elusive, decentralized, and diversified. They operate across borders, using technology to further their control, while maintaining a ruthless grip on the cities they control. But despite their evolution, the consequences of organized crime remain as tragic as ever. One of the primary sources of income for organized crime in major cities is the drug trade. Major cities like Los Angeles, Chicago, Detroit, and New York are epicenters for the trafficking of illegal drugs. The relationship between organized crime and drugs is complex and far-reaching. The Mexican cartels, for example, dominate the trade of heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamine in U.S. cities. In Los Angeles, these cartels often operate in tandem with street gangs that control the retail distribution of drugs. The cycle of addiction, violence, and death continues to devastate communities, with law enforcement struggling to keep up. The overdose death rate in the U.S. has spiked in recent years, with synthetic opioids like fentanyl flooding the streets. Cartels have expanded their networks, infiltrating cities with staggering precision. In Chicago, the problem is further exacerbated by gang violence, where organized crime controls drug territories and settles disputes through brutal means. The Black Disciples and Gangster Disciples, some of the city's largest and most influential gangs, control a significant portion of the narcotics trade. The violence between rival factions has turned neighborhoods into war zones, where innocent civilians live in constant fear. Shootings, homicides, and violence against women and children are daily occurrences. In addition to street-level drug dealing, there's the money laundering aspect. Cartels use real estate investments, illegal casinos, and even legitimate businesses like strip clubs and car dealerships to clean their profits. The laundromats of the underworld make billions every year, while the public is left blind to the flow of dirty money entering the economy. While drugs continue to drive a large portion of organized crime's revenue, human trafficking has become one of the most lucrative criminal enterprises, and it's rampant in major cities across the globe. Sex trafficking and labor trafficking are the two major categories, both with horrifying implications. In New York City, for example, traffickers are operating vast networks, luring vulnerable individuals, many of them women and children, through promises of a better life. They are then subjected to unimaginable abuse and forced into prostitution or labor under inhuman conditions. The Russian mafia, Italian mafia, and Eastern European syndicates have been known to recruit or coerce victims through deceptive ads, fake job offers, and even abductions. Once in the grip of these criminal organizations, victims are forced into a life of violence, addiction, and sexual exploitation. These rings are often hidden in plain sight, operating out of high-end apartments or seemingly legitimate escort services. The case of Maya, a 16-year-old runaway from Brooklyn, is one of thousands. She was coerced by a trafficking ring into a life of sexual slavery. The traffickers use drugs to control her, manipulating her into thinking she was in love with one of the gang leaders. It wasn't until she was rescued during a police sting operation that her story of horrific abuse became public. Maya's situation is tragically common. Organizations trafficking minors for sex have become disturbingly adept at hiding their operations. These criminals take advantage of the systemic issues of poverty, homelessness, and lack of opportunity, creating a cycle of exploitation that is hard to break. In 2025, the U.S. government is struggling to combat the growing networks. Law enforcement is overwhelmed, and despite high-profile busts, the demand for human trafficking continues to rise. Another dark side of organized crime is money laundering, a critical operation for these criminal enterprises. Without effective money laundering schemes, organized crime syndicates wouldn't be able to function for long, as their profits would be too easily traceable. Major cities across the U.S. continue to be hubs for laundering money, often through real estate, businesses, and offshore accounts. In Los Angeles, the money laundering operation is so vast that it involves not just the cartels, but also local politicians and corporate figures. Real estate investments in the city's booming property market have become the perfect cover for laundering massive sums. In fact, some of the most high-end neighborhoods in LA are built with money from the drug trade, human trafficking, and extortion. The Russian mafia and Italian organized crime families also use high-value art transactions to launder money. These pieces of art, often stolen or bought with illicit funds, are resold through international networks, making it difficult to track the origins of the funds. In Miami, the issue is even worse. There, money from cocaine and heroin trafficking is cleaned through car dealerships, luxury yacht sales, and even cash-heavy businesses like bars and clubs. The Cartel de Sinaloa, one of the most powerful drug organizations, has used Florida as a conduit for money laundering operations that involve millions of dollars flowing through the state. Organized crime's impact on cities is felt most intensely in the form of violence. The territorial wars between criminal factions often lead to brutal killings, random shootings, and widespread intimidation tactics. In cities like Chicago, Los Angeles, and Detroit, gang wars have claimed thousands of lives, leaving entire neighborhoods in a constant state of fear. The cartel wars in Los Angeles have seen an increase in shootings in broad daylight, with innocent bystanders often becoming victims of crossfire. Drive-by shootings are a common occurrence in neighborhoods like Compton and South Central, where gang violence often spills over into the streets. These criminals don't hesitate to use weapons of mass destruction, including assault rifles and explosives, to maintain their dominance and settle scores. The violence doesn't just end with the criminals involved. Families and entire communities suffer the repercussions. The constant fear of losing loved ones, the pressure of living in neighborhoods dominated by gangs, and the emotional trauma faced by residents are part of the unseen legacy of organized crime. In Detroit, entire families have been wiped out in drug-related shootings. One such case was the brutal murder of the Miller family, whose house was sprayed with bullets by rival gangs fighting over control of a drug route. The youngest daughter, barely 10 years old, was caught in the crossfire. These kinds of tragic events are all too common in cities where organized crime holds sway. Organized crime does not operate in a vacuum. One of the most disturbing aspects of the rise of criminal organizations is the level of political corruption they have fostered. In major cities, it's not just about running illegal businesses. It's about maintaining power through corrupt political figures and law enforcement officers. In Chicago, for instance, the relationship between the police and organized crime has always been a topic of controversy. Reports of officers protecting organized crime families in exchange for bribes are not new. Politicians, too, have been implicated in aiding criminal networks by turning a blind eye or outright accepting payoffs to ignore certain criminal activities. Detroit has been plagued by corruption scandals involving city officials, with some caught accepting bribes to allow illicit activities to thrive in certain neighborhoods. The most disturbing aspect? These political figures are often just as entrenched in the city's power structure as the criminal families themselves. As a result, law enforcement becomes compromised, and organized crime thrives unchecked. In 2025, organized crime continues to hold major cities in its grip. With roots embedded deep within the fabric of urban life, These criminal networks have adapted to modern technologies, used corruption to maintain power, and created a system that breeds violence, fear, and destruction. The effects on individuals, families, and entire communities are devastating, as these gangs and syndicates prioritize profit over the well-being of their cities. The tragic reality is that for many living in these cities, organized crime is an inescapable force, a brutal reminder of the underbelly of urban life. The battle against organized crime is ongoing, but until the roots of this criminal empire are cut, cities will continue to suffer under its weight.